Welcome to GESTA Mundi, where history comes alive. In the spring of 1940, while the world held its breath during the phony war, a dramatic and unexpected turn was about to unfold in the quiet neutral nations of Scandinavia. This is the story of Operation Weserubung, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway. Opening theme, Welcome to GESTA Mundi, where history comes alive. Narrator, in the spring of 1940, the world was holding its breath. The phony war had settled over Europe like a thick fog, a strange and eerie calm that followed the destruction of Poland. On the Western Front, French and German soldiers sat in their bunkers, staring at each other across no man's land, neither side willing to make the first move. But behind the scenes, the war was about to take a dramatic and unexpected turn. The quiet, neutral nations of Scandinavia were about to be dragged into the inferno. This is the story of Operation Weserubung, the German invasion of Denmark and Norway, a daring and audacious gamble that would change the course of the war. Narrator, to understand why Hitler decided to invade Scandinavia, we must look at the strategic situation in the winter of 1940. Germany was desperately dependent on Swedish iron ore. The Swedish mines at Kiruna and Momberget produced millions of tons of high-grade iron ore each year, ore that was essential for the German war machine. Without it, German factories could not produce tanks, ships, or artillery shells. During the winter months, when the Baltic Sea froze over, this ore was shipped through the Norwegian port of Narvik, then down the Norwegian coast to Germany. This route, the Norwegian corridor, was the lifeline of the German war economy. Narrator, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the British Admiralty, understood the importance of this route. He had been pressing for action in Scandinavia since the beginning of the war. Churchill wanted to mine Norwegian territorial waters, forcing German ships out into the open sea where the Royal Navy could intercept them. He also planned to land troops at Narvik and other Norwegian ports to cut off the iron ore supply. The Allies had already drawn up plans for intervention in Norway, and they were preparing to put them into action. Narrator, the Germans, of course, were watching these developments with growing alarm. In December 1939, the Norwegian fascist leader Vidkun Quisling visited Berlin and warned Hitler that the British were planning to occupy Norway. Quisling, whose name would become synonymous with treachery, had been cultivating ties with the Nazis for years. His warnings, combined with German intelligence reports, convinced Hitler that he must act first. On February 16, 1940, the British destroyer HMS Cossack entered Norwegian waters to rescue nearly 300 British prisoners from the German supply ship Altmark. This incident, the Altmark affair, demonstrated that the British were willing to violate Norwegian neutrality, and it shocked Hitler into action. Narrator, Hitler ordered his military commanders to draw up plans for the invasion of Scandinavia. The operation was given the codename Weserubung, literally Weser exercise, named after the Weser River in Germany. The planning was carried out in great secrecy by a small team of officers under the command of General Nikolaus von Falkenhorst, a veteran of the Finnish campaign of World War I. Falkenhorst had just 48 hours to prepare the initial plan, and he worked from a Baedeker tourist guidebook he bought at a bookshop, since the German military had no detailed maps of Norway. Narrator, the plan was extraordinarily ambitious. The Germans would simultaneously invade Denmark and Norway, seizing the key ports and airfields in a coordinated surprise attack. The operation would involve the entire German surface fleet, including its most modern battleships and cruisers. The Kriegsmarine would transport troops to their landing sites, while the Luftwaffe would provide air cover and airborne assault troops. It was the first major combined operation in military history, involving Army, Navy, and Air Forces working together in a tightly coordinated plan. Narrator: the plan called for 6 separate landing groups. Group 1 would seize Narvik in the far north. Group 2 would take Trondheim. Group 3 would land at Bergen. Group 4 would capture Kristiansand. Group 5 would take Oslo, the capital. And Group 6 would conduct the invasion of Denmark, a separate but simultaneous operation. The key to success was surprise. The Germans would have to reach their objectives before the Norwegians could mobilize their defenses. Every hour counted, and any delay could spell disaster. Narrator: the risks were enormous. The German Navy, the Kriegsmarine, was far smaller than the British Royal Navy. If the British intercepted the invasion fleet at sea, the result would be a massacre. The German surface fleet could not afford a major battle with the Royal Navy. The plan also required the German ships to cross the North Sea, refuel at Norwegian ports, and return to Germany before the British could react. Any ships caught in Norwegian waters by daylight would be sitting ducks for British submarines and bombers. Narrator: the invasion was originally scheduled for early April, but it was postponed due to disagreements between the German Navy and Army. Meanwhile, the Allies were preparing their own operation, Plan R4, to land troops in Norway. The race for Scandinavia was on. The Germans would strike first. On April 1, 1940, Hitler gave the final order. Weserubung would begin on April 9. Narrator: at 4:15 a.m. on April 9, 1940, German troops crossed the border into Denmark. The invasion of Denmark, codenamed Weserubung Sud, was a near-bloodless affair. The Danish army, caught completely by surprise, offered only scattered resistance. The Danish government had been hoping to maintain neutrality, and the military was not on full alert. German soldiers marched into Copenhagen almost unopposed. Narrator: the key to the invasion of Denmark was the capture of Copenhagen itself. German troops landed at the Copenhagen harbor from the mine layer Handstadt Danzig, marching off the ship without warning and capturing the Danish garrison at Kastellet. Simultaneously, German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, captured the Aalborg airfields in northern Denmark, the first time paratroopers were used in combat in history. The Danish king, Christian X, faced an impossible choice. His army was outnumbered and outgunned, and the Luftwaffe was positioned to bomb Copenhagen. Narrator: after just 2 hours of fighting, the Danish government surrendered. The entire country had fallen in less than 6 hours, with only 16 Danish soldiers killed. King Christian X, who had ridden through the streets of Copenhagen every morning on his horse to show his solidarity with his people, ordered his army to cease resistance. Denmark would remain under German occupation for the next 5 years, a relatively gentle occupation by Nazi standards, but a national humiliation nonetheless. The quick fall of Denmark gave the Germans a crucial base for operations against Norway. Narrator: while Denmark fell in hours, Norway would prove a far more difficult target. The Norwegian government had been warned of an impending invasion by the German envoy, who demanded that Norway surrender without resistance. The Norwegian government, led by Prime Minister Johan Nygaardsvold, refused. The Norwegian king, Håkon VII, and his government prepared to fight. But the Germans were already on the move. Narrator: the German plan was to seize all major Norwegian ports simultaneously. The most important target was Oslo, the capital. The German force assigned to capture Oslo, Group 5, sailed up the Oslofjord on the night of April 8 to 9, led by the heavy cruiser Blücher, the newest and most modern ship in the German Navy. The plan was to sail directly to Oslo and present the Norwegian government with a fait accompli at dawn. Narrator: but the Norwegians were ready. As the Blücher led the German fleet through the narrow waters of the Oslofjord, it passed the Oscarsborg fortress, an aging coastal fortification that the Germans had assumed was unmanned or obsolete. They were tragically wrong. At 4:21 a.m., the commander of the fortress, Colonel Birger Eriksson, gave the order to fire. The fortress's old German-made Krupp cannons, dating from 1892, opened fire at point-blank range. 2 shells struck the Blücher, setting it ablaze. Narrator: moments later, the fortress's torpedo battery, also dating from the turn of the century, launched its torpedoes. 2 torpedoes struck the Blücher below the waterline. The ship began to sink. Within minutes, the Blücher was listing heavily, flames consuming its superstructure. The crew and the troops on board were forced to abandon ship. Over 1,000 German soldiers and sailors died in the freezing waters of the Oslofjord. The Blücher sank at 7:30 a.m., becoming the first major warship lost in the Norwegian campaign. Narrator: the sinking of the Blücher was a disaster for the German plan. The German landing force was scattered, and the plan to capture Oslo before dawn had failed. The delay gave King Haakon VII, the Norwegian government, and the Norwegian gold reserves, some of the largest in Europe, time to escape. They fled north by train and car, heading for the town of Elverum, where the Norwegian parliament, the Storting, would continue the fight. The gold reserves, over 40 tons of gold bullion worth billions in today's money, were loaded onto trucks and hidden from the advancing Germans. Narrator: despite the disaster at Oslo, the German landings at other Norwegian ports were largely successful. Narvik, the crucial port in the far north, was captured by German destroyers under Commodore Friedrich Bondt. 10 German destroyers carrying 2,000 mountain troops had sailed through a blizzard to reach Narvik, achieving complete surprise. The Norwegian garrison, commanded by Colonel Konrad Sundlo, a quisling sympathizer, surrendered without a fight. Trondheim, Bergen, Stavanger, and Kristiansand all fell to the Germans within the first day. Narrator: the German capture of Norwegian ports was swift, but the campaign was far from over. The Norwegian armed forces, though taken by surprise, began to mobilize. The Norwegian army, which had been in the middle of demobilization when the invasion struck, was able to field about 50,000 men, poorly equipped but highly motivated. They fought a fighting retreat northward, delaying the Germans at every opportunity. Narrator: the British, caught off guard by the German invasion, scrambled to respond. The Royal Navy immediately moved to intercept the German ships. On April 10, just a day after the landings, British destroyers under Captain Bernard Warburton Lee attacked the German destroyers at Narvik. The First Battle of Narvik was a fierce engagement. The British sank 2 German destroyers but lost 2 of their own, and Warburton Lee was killed, earning a posthumous Victoria Cross. Narrator: on April 13, the British returned with the battleship HMS Warspite and a force of destroyers. The Second Battle of Narvik was a decisive British victory. All 8 remaining German destroyers at Narvik were sunk or scuttled. The German naval force that had carried the invasion to Narvik was completely destroyed. The Kriegsmarine had lost 1/3 of its destroyer strength in a single day, a blow from which it would never fully recover. Narrator: the Allies landed their own ground forces in central Norway, at Andelsnes and Namsos, in an attempt to capture Trondheim. But the campaign was poorly planned and executed. The Allies landed without heavy equipment, air support, or proper coordination. The Luftwaffe, operating from captured Norwegian airfields, dominated the skies. German bombers, led by the fearsome Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, attacked the Allied positions relentlessly. The Allies were forced to evacuate central Norway by early May. Narrator: the fighting in Norway was brutal and confusing. In the Gudbrandsdal Valley, Norwegian and British troops fought a series of delaying actions against the advancing German forces. The German general, Ferdinand Schorner, leading a brigade of Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops, pushed the Allies northward. At the village of Kvam, the Norwegians held off the Germans for an entire day, fighting in the snow and forests. It was one of the few defensive successes of the campaign. Narrator: the battle for southern Norway was reaching its climax. The Norwegian government and King Haakon VII were determined to continue the fight, but the military situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Germans, advancing from Oslo, pushed northward against increasingly desperate Norwegian resistance. The Norwegian commander in eastern Norway, General Otto Ruge, fought a skillful delaying campaign, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. He had no air force, no tanks, and barely enough ammunition for his troops. Narrator: on April 14, German forces captured the town of Elverum, where the Norwegian Storting had been meeting. King Haakon and his government were forced to flee further north, to the town of Nybergsund. The next day, the Luftwaffe bombed Nybergsund, their Stukas diving out of the sky to attack the small town. The king and his ministers had to take cover in the snowbanks as the bombs fell. Miraculously, none of them were killed. The bombing of Nybergsund hardened the Norwegian resolve to resist. Narrator: in the far north, the situation was more promising for the Allies. The German garrison at Narvik, cut off from supply by the Royal Navy, was running out of food and ammunition. The German mountain troops, General Dietl's 3rd Mountain Division, were fighting for survival in the Arctic conditions. On April 28, Allied forces launched an offensive to recapture Narvik. French and Polish troops, including the French Foreign Legion, fought alongside the Norwegians. Narrator: the battle for Narvik was the most intense of the Norwegian campaign. The terrain was brutal, steep mountains covered in deep snow, with temperatures well below freezing. The German defenders were experienced Gebirgsjäger, mountain troops who had trained for this kind of warfare. The Allies, including Norwegian, French, Polish, and British troops, attacked uphill against entrenched German positions. Progress was measured in yards per day. Narrator: after weeks of brutal fighting, the Allies finally captured Narvik on May 28. It was the first Allied victory on land in the entire war. The Norwegian, French, Polish, and British troops raised their flags over the captured town. But their victory was hollow. Events hundreds of miles to the south had made the recapture of Narvik meaningless. The German blitzkrieg had smashed through the French and British lines in the Ardennes. The Battle of France had begun, and the Allied forces in Norway were desperately needed at home. Narrator: the German invasion of France and the Low Countries on May 10, 1940, changed everything. Norway, which had been the main theater of the war, became a sideshow overnight. The Allies, facing catastrophic defeat in France, decided to abandon the Norwegian campaign. On June 3, the Allies began the evacuation of their forces from Norway, just days after capturing Narvik. The Norwegian government and King Haakon VII were told the devastating news. Narrator: King Haakon VII faced an agonizing decision. He could surrender to the Germans, or he could continue the fight from exile in London. With the support of his government, he chose the latter. On June 7, the king, the crown prince, and the Norwegian government sailed from Tromsø on the British cruiser HMS Devonshire. They would establish a government in exile in London, continuing the fight for Norwegian freedom. Narrator: the Norwegian army was ordered to lay down its arms. On June 10, General Ruge signed the surrender. The Norwegian campaign was over. The Germans had conquered Norway in just 2 months, but at a heavy cost. The Kriegsmarine had been shattered. It had lost the heavy cruiser Blücher, 2 light cruisers, 10 destroyers, and numerous smaller vessels. Much of the German surface fleet was at the bottom of the Norwegian fjords. The Kriegsmarine would never again be strong enough to challenge the Royal Navy in a surface battle. Narrator: the cost in human lives was also significant. The Norwegians lost 1,335 soldiers and over 600 civilians. The British lost 4,000 soldiers and sailors. The French and Polish lost 530 men. The Germans lost almost 5,300 soldiers, sailors, and airmen. The German victory in Norway was a tactical success, but a strategic disaster for their navy. The Kriegsmarine would never recover. Narrator: the occupation of Norway lasted 5 long years, from 1940 to 1945. The Germans installed a civilian government under Vidkun Quisling, but Quisling's regime was deeply unpopular. The Norwegian resistance movement, Milorg, conducted sabotage operations, smuggled refugees to neutral Sweden, and gathered intelligence for the Allies. The clandestine Norwegian press published underground newspapers, and Norwegian teachers refused to teach Nazi propaganda. Narrator: the Norwegian merchant fleet, one of the largest in the world, escaped to Allied ports and played a crucial role in the Battle of the Atlantic. Over 4,000 Norwegian merchant seamen lost their lives keeping the supply lines open to Britain. The phrase "Norway fights on" became a rallying cry for the Norwegian people in exile. Norwegian pilots flew Spitfires for the Royal Air Force, and Norwegian commandos conducted daring raids against German positions in Norway. Narrator: the most famous Norwegian operation of the war was the raid on the heavy water plant at Vemork, Telemark, in 1943. The Norwegian resistance, with British support, destroyed the German heavy water production facility, preventing the Nazis from developing an atomic bomb. The story of the Norwegian heavy water saboteurs has become one of the most celebrated tales of the war. Narrator: for the Germans, the Norwegian campaign was a mixed blessing. They gained control of the Norwegian coast, which they used as a base for U-boat operations against Allied shipping. They also secured the iron ore supply from Sweden. But the cost in naval strength was catastrophic. The Kriegsmarine would never again be able to launch a major surface operation. When Hitler later planned the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, the lack of a strong German surface fleet was a decisive factor in its abandonment. Narrator: the Norwegian campaign had a profound impact on the course of the war. The desperate fighting in Norway delayed the German invasion of France by several weeks, giving the Allies a little more time to prepare their defenses. The heavy losses suffered by the Kriegsmarine meant that the German Navy could not play a significant role in the invasion of the Soviet Union the following year. And the Norwegian campaign exposed serious flaws in Allied military planning, flaws that would be brutally exposed in the Battle of France. Narrator: perhaps the most important consequence of the Norwegian campaign was political. The failure of the British campaign in Norway led to the fall of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain in May 1940. Chamberlain, who had pursued a policy of appeasement and presided over the disastrous Norwegian campaign, was replaced by Winston Churchill. Churchill, the man who had been pressing for action in Norway all along, became Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the very day Hitler invaded France. It was one of the most consequential political changes in history. Narrator: the Norwegian campaign also taught valuable lessons about combined operations. The Germans had pioneered the use of air power, naval forces, and ground troops working together in a coordinated assault. The Allies would learn these lessons the hard way, applying them later in North Africa, Sicily, and finally on D-Day. The landing at Normandy in 1944 owed much to the painful lessons learned in the fjords of Norway 4 years earlier. Narrator: for the people of Norway, the war was a time of hardship, sacrifice, and resistance. The occupation, though brutal, never broke the Norwegian spirit. The Norwegian resistance was one of the most effective in occupied Europe, and the Norwegian government in exile played a significant role in the Allied war effort. King Haakon VII, who had refused to surrender and led his government from London, became a symbol of Norwegian resistance. He returned to Oslo on June 7, 1945, exactly 5 years after he had been forced to leave. Narrator: the Norwegian campaign is often called the Forgotten Campaign of World War II, overshadowed by the dramatic events in France and the Battle of Britain that followed. But it was a campaign of extraordinary courage and sacrifice, fought in conditions of extreme hardship. It was the first campaign of the war where all 3 services fought together, and it set the pattern for the combined operations that would ultimately win the war. It was a campaign that changed the course of history. Narrator: the Norwegian campaign also had a deep impact on the Nordic countries. Denmark's quick surrender contrasted with Norway's determined resistance, creating a lasting difference in how the 2 nations remember the war. In Finland, watching from afar, the German success in Norway reinforced the belief that Germany was invincible. It would play a role in Finland's decision to ally with Germany against the Soviet Union in 1941. Narrator: the story of Operation Weserubung is a story of audacity and risk. The Germans gambled everything on a daring plan, and they won, but at a terrible cost. The Norwegian campaign demonstrated that air power and surprise could overcome naval superiority, but it also showed that wars are not won by conquest alone. The Norwegian people fought on, in exile, in the resistance, and in the hearts of the free world. Their courage was a beacon of hope in the darkest days of the war. Narrator: the conquest of Norway was complete, but the war was far from over. The German blitzkrieg had swept through Scandinavia, but now it was turning west. While the snow melted in the Norwegian mountains, Hitler was preparing the hammer blow that would shatter the armies of France and bring the war to the English Channel. Join us next time for Episode 5, as we witness the fall of the Low Countries, the German breakthrough at Sedan, and the dramatic evacuation of Dunkirk. The storm was about to break over Western Europe. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please like and subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of GESTA MUNDI.